welcome to Princeton TV. We have with us today a scholar of religion. Her name is June McDaniel. Now, I've known her for, of course, I think maybe a couple of decades at least, having met her when she was a young graduate student at the University of Chicago in the Divinity School. I'm dating myself, of course, now, but that's not the point of the interview. So I'm very happy to have her here today at Princeton TV to talk with her about mysticism, her interest in Asian religions, culture, and interpretations of religious experiences and the like. She's a professor of religious studies at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and she has spent many years in Asia studying mystics, ecstatic mystics in particular. Today, she's going to talk to us about something that recently she's been writing about for a book on Sudhir Kakar's work, the psychoanalyst based in India. Welcome to Princeton TV, June. How are you?
Fine, and it's nice to see you again.
Excellent, excellent. So tell me about your paper in this book that we've put together on psychoanalysis, culture, and religion, where you take up the whole idea of mysticism and psychoanalysis.
Well, it puts Kakar in relationship to other psychoanalysts, and it talks about what his unique contribution is. Mm-hmm. So the way it begins is studying definitions of ecstasy, of which there are many, and definitions of mysticism. And it then goes into what I call the pathologizing of mysticism, mm-hmm. the problem that many forms of psychoanalysis see mysticism as a very bad, pathological, regressive, narcissistic phenomena. So I go through a number of them, and I talk about the way that Kakar has had a more positive view of mysticism. He distinguishes between what he calls the empathic or relational type, which is between people, and also the vertical type, which is more ascetic and deals with the supernatural. Mm-hmm. That one he still can't manage to grasp. He's still not too sympathetic to that. But he is sympathetic to the relational sort, and he's very interested in having the boundaries of identity kind of melt so that people's identities can fuse together and mm-hmm. People become very close. So I talk about that, and I also talk about the research that I did, which was interviewing mystics and ecstatics and finding out about their lives.
Right, no, but you've done that for a number of years, right? Because that was kind of the topic of your very first book, Madness of the Saints.
Right. So that was where my interest in all of this started.
Right. So let's go to the beginning. How did you develop an interest in this esoteric topic?
Well, when I was in college, I was very interested in symbolism. I was interested in the unconscious. I was interested in the arts and myth. And at that point, I was an artist. You would suggest that I bring a book. This book is one of my illustrations, and this book actually is a collection of papers which I co-edited from the American Academy of Religion, and it's called Mystical Sensuality. So that shows my early interest in the arts. I wanted to go into religion then, but unfortunately where I was, which was the State University of New York at Albany, mm-hmm. there was no religious studies. The closest I could do was philosophy, so I went into art and philosophy. Graduate school was another story, mm-hmm. and I was debating between psychology and religion. And I applied to schools for both, and as it happened, religious studies gave me money, and I was a broke graduate student. I went with the money, and I got a master's degree in religious studies from Emory University.
I see.
That one was in Christian theology, because that was what they could fund at Candler Seminary. Mm-hmm. So the master's work that I did was comparing Carl Jung and St. John of the Cross on death and rebirth of the personality. Both of them see this as part of religious vision and also religious transformation.
Both, when you say both, you mean Jung and St. John of the Cross?
Right.
I see.
They both have a phenomena of destruction of the personality and rebirth. Mm-hmm. And one puts it in more Christian language, one puts it in more psychological language, but the phenomena is extremely similar.
Right, and of course Jung would have read, of course, all the classics, right, and would have been aware of St. John of the Cross and his teachings.
That's very good. So I ended up studying a mystical topic while in a Christian environment. Then I decided for my doctoral work, I wanted to study Hinduism. I figured I would have one graduate degree in each hemisphere. So I had the Western Hemisphere for the master's.
I see.
I had the Eastern Hemisphere for the doctorate.
I see.
And I had
But you never thought about becoming a mystic yourself.
Oh, I've had some mystical experiences in my life, and those have been motivating too.
Okay, interesting.
But in the field of religious studies, you don't really study your own experience. What you do is you study the experiences of others.
Right.
And the question is, which tradition had the richest collection of mystics? Which tradition had the most interesting saints, the people that I could go out and talk to and find out about?
Mm-hmm.
And I had, while I was an undergrad, met a guru from India that some friends had brought over to Brooklyn, New York. And he was always falling into these bhavs and getting possessed.
And who was that? Can you name the person? Or?
Yeah, his name was Prahlad Chandra Brahmachari.
I see.
And he was a Bengali mystic who'd spent a lot of his life in a cave, didn't know any English, but was just sort of amazing in terms of all these states he was falling into.
But this is not the flower power days, right? This is well after that.
This would have been in the 80s.
80s, okay. So well past the hippie age of the United States.
Well, perhaps. I mean, there might have been some hippies still around. I have no evidence for this. But he was somebody who impressed me. And when I thought of doing doctoral work, I thought, where are there living mystics who are impressive? I thought, aha, West Bengal. That is where I'll go. So
Okay.
I studied Bengali and studied history of religions in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. And I went out to West Bengal to find mystics.
So are you one of Wendy's children? Is that we can describe you as such, or?
Well, it depends on how you use that term. I have one of her children, technically speaking, in that she was my advisor.
Right.
However, we did not agree on our perspectives on religious phenomena.
Right, because she's also in the book, right? She has one of the lead chapters in the book about a Freudian analysis of lingam, and how lingam sometimes is a cigar and sometimes it's not a cigar.
Well, that would indeed be a topic that would interest her, yes.
Okay.
But my perspective was a little different. I tend to find the Freudian perspective useful in certain situations, but very limited.
I see.
So I am not her child in the sense that I did not adopt her methodology.
Okay.
And what I did was try to find out some of the deeper experiences that people were having. So I spoke to all sorts of fascinating people who lived in caves, who lived out in the woods. Many had not had much experience with Westerners, but they had lots of experiences with gods. So this was very interesting to me. And that was what I did in the book, and that was my dissertation topic. Technically speaking, the dissertation topic was the word bhav. And I was looking at all the different meanings and the ways that people understood it. But when I turned it into a book from University of Chicago Press, I focused on the people that I had interviewed. And it was called The Madness of the Saints.
Right.
And I was looking at how people understand madness, how they understand ecstasy, and how people tell the difference, because this is a great problem worldwide.
Right, right. But so you found that in South Asia there is a taxonomy that they use, right, to differentiate between ecstatic states versus madness, if you will.
Oh yeah, they list things like the sattvika bhavs. They list the symptoms that occur. They have experts who can come down and analyze people. They even use the Christian approach of know them by their fruits. So you look and see what a mystic has accomplished, and you can see the person from that perspective. Now, when I was studying them, what I found was that there was like a set list of life events that happened with these people.
Okay.
So they started out as ecstatics in childhood. They would have visions in childhood. The parents often were extremely upset about this, and they would call Ayurvedic doctors and they would call exorcists to try to get the child back to normal. Sometimes they would try to get them married as a way to get them back.
But when you say certain experiences, are you saying like possession or dissociation or kind of out of body? Can you classify what you mean by these early experiences?
Right. Well, in the book, I went through a dozen different figures, and it ranged, but mostly they would have visions of gods. They would have visions of traveling outside of the body. Sometimes they would have visions of ghosts or people who had died. So we would have this sort of phenomena that would sort of scare the parents. So they would try to cure the child. It generally did not work, and the child would grow up, go out traveling, become a wandering sadhu, go out into the woods, and learn about what these visions were teaching him or her. Eventually, the person generally would come back to society, learn through ritual how to limit the religious experience, and then become a guru and teach others. I saw this in person after person. The function of ritual was not to induce religious experience, it was to limit and control it.
I see. And then what function would they serve after integration into the society?
Well, many of them would be guides, spiritual guides for people who would help them along the spiritual path. Some of them would be counselors. So if people had personal problems, they would go out and they would talk to the guru about it. The guru would help them out. A lot of people are concerned about death. And this is a great problem that we have in the West. What do we tell people about a good death? And it's one of the limits of secular society. There's only so much they can say. Whereas spiritual teachers and gurus have quite a bit to say, and they can talk about death and also what comes after it.
And some of them also become healers, right?
There's a lot of alternative healing. Many of these people developed what are sometimes called siddhis, supernatural powers. So they had abilities like healing, the reading of minds, the reading of hearts, being able to tell what was bothering people if the people themselves didn't know. So they would get different kinds of insights, and healing was one type of insight or ability that they would develop.
So the taxonomy that you developed in your work, how does that map onto something like a DSM-4 or 5 taxonomy?
Well, the DSM-4, the diagnostic manual, is very limited in what they have to say that people have as possibilities. So they can say, well, if a person is not bothered by visions, we can say that the visions are okay. They've moved to the point where they can say, well, they're cultural, and if they're culturally accepted, they're okay. But in terms of having any truth value, in terms of having any ability to affect the society, the DSM is still a bit hesitant on that dimension.
So then how does your understanding then of this wide sort of landscape of religious experience frame the issue of psychoanalytic interpretations of religious experience, do you think?
Well, I would have to say that my views are kind of different than most psychoanalysts, because what they're trying to do is fit it into a model. And it's a reasonable thing to do, to fit experience into a model. But the models tend to be very narrow, and they tend to be pathologies. If we go back to Freud, who is a revered founder, most of what we see is that human emotion and human thought is negative. What are the major instincts that we have? Lust, aggression, maybe fear. The positive side is maybe if they're sublimated. But sublimation is kind of a secondary phenomena. What's primary in human beings is what we might call a sort of original sin, a kind of negative view of the instincts. And I think a lot of psychoanalysts who have followed Freud see that same negative view of humanity. So you can't really have anything like a spiritual goal. The most that you can have is kind of ordinary neurosis, maybe being able to love and to work.
Right, of course. Spiritualism is kind of seen as interpretively masked forms of, other kind of underlying emotions, right? Is that what you're suggesting?
Right. I mean, there is no positive spirituality.
But Kakar kind of brings a different lens to this, right? As a cultural analyst.
Yeah, well, if you look at the different books that he's written, his earlier books tend to be much more along the lines of traditional psychoanalysts. So if you look at his one on shamans, mystics, and doctors, he's still psychoanalyzing these people, talking about the problems that they had. But as he becomes more of a novelist, and as he kind of grows older and mellows, he seems to become much more sympathetic to these altered kinds of experiences. And the kind that he's particularly sympathetic to is the empathic type, which he sees very useful for healing, both for gurus and for psychoanalysts. Because what you can do is go into the sort of mind world of your patient, or the mind world of your disciple. You can share at a very deep level. And if you can share at a very deep level, that can help to heal them.
But why is fusion, though, so central to the healing process, you think?
Well, if we say that people are basically alienated, which many people will say, there are a lot of insane people alone in their own worlds. And it is very helpful if you can have a compassionate savior, a hero figure who can come down and take you out of your own hell. And if you are just isolated, even if it's not in a hell world, but it's just in the secular world, you can have somebody say that there is a greater realm of love, a greater realm of sharing. So the kind of traumas that might be blocking your perceptions can be sort of open to the light. So it gives people a kind of confidence in sharing and a confidence in other people that they might not have otherwise.
Okay. And then how about kind of the interpretive use of mythology in this context? I mean, within this context of fusion and, kind of the power to be able to shape your own story with the help of, as you're saying, a guru or an adept, teacher. Where does mythology fit into your scheme of things?
Well, as I mentioned, my master's was on Jung, and I'm kind of sympathetic to him. And he tends to say that it's easier to work through traumas if they are put into the context of mythic stories. So if it's not just you, but say it's Persephone being thrown down into hell, having to be rescued, okay? Or if it's Ganesh having his head chopped off, okay? All of these can represent events in your life. And if your traumatic event is too difficult for you to go near, okay? If you have too many defenses to remember your own traumas, what you can do is let loose some of that emotion through mythic events that are similar to your own. And in that way, you can approach your own memories. So the myths act as a technique of healing because they reenact things that happen to you or that represent difficulties that you've had.
I see. But if you don't believe kind of in the Jungian framework or the unconscious or the subconscious, the collective, then how do you just treat them as kind of, semiotic webs of associations, or how do you make sense of symbolic content that's not necessarily from your own mind, but it's from kind of the collective repository of symbols?
Okay, well, it depends what field you're talking about. If you're talking about the field of history of religions, what we end up doing is looking at myth and finding out the values of the culture. So you see how the myths work, and you see what's important and what is valued, what is not valued. It gives you insights into cultural ideals. If you're looking at it from a psychological perspective, you might say from a Freudian perspective, it might represent concerns that the person would have. But it depends if you're looking at it from an academic perspective or a practitioner perspective or a psychological perspective.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about sort of the paradigmatic myths, whether it's the Oedipus or the Ganesha or the goddess in Hinduism, and how, of course, Freud responded to it 100 years ago, and how a recent sort of wave of psychoanalysts have been able to deal with it. And you're saying in the history of religion tradition, you would look at all kind of variations of the same themes, right? And to figure out its value in the culture and then place it in importance accordingly.
Well, the field of history of religions is really very much the history of ideas. So what we do is we look at important ideas in the culture and the way they've developed. And very often that comes to be associated with the mythic stories and the rituals and even the temple structures that you'll see at a given time. So if you're looking at the history of ideas, myth becomes important for values. If you're looking at it from a practitioner perspective, this becomes a symbol of how you grow and how you become a more mature and more spiritual person.
Right.
If you're looking at it psychoanalytically, these become the symbols that represent the ailments and the things that you need to overcome.
So what are you working on now? Tell me, just to sort of shift gears a little bit, what's your current preoccupation?
Well, I do have a big book on the pathologizing of ecstasy, which I have to cut down from its current 600 pages and is going to get published one of these years. And the field work I've been doing recently has been on Balinese Hinduism. Okay, so Bali is an island in Indonesia, and it's kind of unique in Indonesia.
Yeah, I was just there recently, actually.
Beautiful place.
Beautiful, yes.
And I became interested in it initially when one of my students did a bachelor's essay on it. And she talked about the differences between the official government Hinduism and the religion that people actually followed there. So when I went, I started looking at that, and I noticed there were actually 3 levels of religion that you could find. So there was kind of a folk religion where they adopted Hindu images and a few Hindu terms, and that became sort of a folk Hinduism. There was a classical Hinduism that came from the Majapahit Empire in Java, where when the Muslims came in.
About 1,500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago or so?
Yeah. So they basically fled to Bali and brought a whole high culture there. And then we have the government monotheism, where in order to get along with the Christians and the Muslims and the other religions there, the Indonesian government declared that all religions had to be monotheistic. So what we have is a whole set of academics and writers who are reinterpreting Hinduism in monotheistic fashion.
How does that happen? You mean like kind of making it, I think you sent me a couple of papers on that, kind of making Hinduism a religion of the book?
Yeah, and they developed their own high god called Sanyang Widiwasa, which is something like Brahman. He is sort of invisible, so people don't worship him very much, but he's still there, so you can claim that you are a monotheism. If you are a monotheism, you cannot be bothered by missionaries from either Islam or Christianity, and you have the right to practice as you choose. So they've been developing their own kind of Hinduism through the school curriculum, and they've been putting Hinduism into public schools. And the curriculum that they've developed is really very impressive. They have Vedanta, they have Sankhya, they have Shaiva Siddhanta, they have all these different approaches that they have incorporated. So again, from a history of ideas perspective, it's very interesting the way they are consciously developing the religion.
And how does it interact with other faiths? Like Indonesia, by law, I think allows 6 or 7 different faiths to be practiced, right? Publicly.
Right. And all of them are, all of the accepted religions are monotheistic.
Right.
So they found a monotheistic God for Buddhism. They found a monotheistic God for Confucianism. They already had one for the Christianities and for Islam. But they all have a way to interact legitimately and religiously, as opposed to just kind of ignoring each other or having a total separation between church and state.
Right, of course, something like this would never happen in India, right? Which is polymorphously polytheistic.
Well, it would be useful if there were more teaching of religion in the colleges and the universities.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay,
since it's
speak to
not,
that. Speak to that. But what about? Well, I'm sure when you did your research, there were these Hindu universities, right? Banaras Hindu and various other sort of Hindu schools, teaching scriptural knowledge and what have you. Are you saying they're kind of disappearing, or what?
well, there's very few of them. The comparative religion is generally not a topic that is taught in Hindu universities. We have courses on the Gita, we have courses on the Puranas, we have courses on the Vedas. But in the general area of religion, of understanding what a religion is, how it compares in a worldwide setting, there are very few universities that have programs in this. And I think it's very important for India to be able to have that so it can have a kind of sophisticated dialogue with the rest of the world.
Okay. And so you think that would be relevant vis-a-vis kind of the passing of yoga and other Vedic traditions and Ayurveda, that all of these things are now becoming global.
Right, and they are being adopted and they are being argued by different countries. And it would be useful for India to have many areas of debate as just opposed to it's ours.
Right.
And people in the West say, no, it isn't.
Right.
So, I mean, there could be many more levels of debate to something like that. And these issues of authenticity are debated in yoga, are debated in Taoism, in Buddhism. There's a debate as to whether we have a world Buddhism or only individual types. So this is something we see in the whole area of world religion.
But this is happening mostly in the United States, though, right? You would say in the kind of the New Age subcultures of the United States?
Well, I think it started in the United States. But if you go to Europe, and I was just talking this summer at Oxford, Cambridge, and Kent, the same issues are being explored in England. And if they're in England, I assume they're in other places as well.
Okay.
So this kind of discourse of world religions is going throughout the world. And I think it would be very helpful for India to have more classes in the philosophy of religion, in comparative discourse in religion, comparative ritual, comparative theologies, so it could participate more.
But how has the U.S., though, you would say, with the changes kind of the immigration law in '60s, with Kennedy and Johnson changing the immigration law, allowing more, non-Western peoples to come into the shores, how has that changed the fabric of the United States? Do you think there's a correlation there where the U.S. now becomes more diverse and you see this flowering of all kinds of religions in the United States?
Well, I think it's clearly more diverse. I mean, we have Hindu temples sprouting up all over the United States. We have lots of technology people who are from India and lots of doctors. As to how much it has affected Hinduism itself, we have some mixings and matchings in New Age, but mostly people have temples here that do the same kind of traditional Hinduism that you see in India. There's a lot of just taking it from India, bringing it here, and not really adapting and changing very much. This is one of the reasons why Bali interests me, because there's so much change.
Interesting. Okay. So that's one of the projects you're working on. So what else should we know, though, in terms of, let's say, history of religious studies in the United States? What is it that India can learn?
Well, there are a lot of theorists in the United States, and it would be useful just to know the history of what these different theorists had to say. In American religious studies, there's a tendency to use theorists to dismiss religious claims. And there is no way to rebut that or to work against it unless you actually know what these people had to say and you can find the problems in their arguments. So I think the sort of arguments that people have in psychology of religion, in religious studies and theology are very important. I think it would be helpful for India, for instance, to learn the history of Christian theology, a long history of argument, according to one of my old professors, to see the kinds of arguments that people have had and be able to compare the arguments within Hinduism to the arguments within Christianity and say what kinds of conclusions people have come to. And, be able to justify ideas on both sides.
Fascinating. And you argue, I think in one of your interviews, that this will make the world a more tolerant place if people actually knew kind of the histories and the variations of the various sort of trajectories that religions have taken over many, many centuries. So on that poignant point,
That's the ultimate goal.
we've used up all of our allotted time. So I thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you so much.